My name is Roger Russell, and I am the Associate Director here at Locus Library. This has been a fantastic season for our lecture series. This spring has been very successful, so thank you to all of you who are coming back for a second or third or however many times. This is our last lecture in the spring series, but stay tuned. We will be doing more of them in the fall, so keep an ear out for an announcement about that. The Medical History Interest Group presentations are sponsored by the Locus Library History Collections and the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies. Just a few logistics. If you haven't already, there's a sign-in sheet, and it would really help us to know how our attendances are doing. So please do that on the way out if you haven't already. Other things, if you're attending for the ECU Wellness Passport Program and you haven't gotten a stamp yet, Lane Carpenter, who's in the back row, can help you with that. The refreshments have been out for a while. It looks like everyone's had some, but if you haven't, while I'm going on and on about all the stuff I've got to say, please feel free to get another cookie. Out of courtesy, if you've got a device, if you wouldn't mind silencing that. Just a few more quick things. We've got a lot of exhibits in the library, not just on the 4th floor here. There's one down on the 2nd floor entitled The Armstrongs of Rocky Mount, 3 Generations, 3 Doctors, and More. You'll find some other exhibits across campus, but a lot of them actually are up here on the 4th floor. There's some medical anatomy plates in the back on the wall, a microscope collection here. There's the Toll of the American Civil War Life and Limb exhibit, so check those out if you haven't already. Today's presentation will be by Dr. Jeffrey P. Baker. Dr. Baker is Professor of Pediatrics and History at Duke University School of Medicine, where he serves as Director of the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine. He has practiced for over 25 years as a general pediatrician with a focus on children with autism and special needs. He directed the Duke Children's Autism Clinic for 2 years and remains actively engaged with Duke's Center for Autism and Brain Development, providing a home for this population. Dr. Baker's publications have also centered on child health, most notably the history of neonatal medicine, vaccine controversies, and autism. He has taught a wide variety of historical topics to undergraduate and health profession students, including the history of medical ethics, disability, and race in medicine. So here to present his lecture, The Transformation of Autism, I give you Dr. Jeffrey Baker.
Thank you very much, President. All right, am I mic'd yet? Is this okay? Great, thank you. I apologize about the last-minute drama. I wear probably too many hats. So I'm a practicing doctor. I direct an ethics center. I try to be an historian. And it's all kind of coming together today, so I left a little closer. I allowed enough time, but not as much as I should have, and then I got in a big auto accident, so sorry about that. Not an auto accident myself, but on the highway, so thanks to all of you for your patience. Sorry about that. I'd like to get a sense of the kind of background of folks here. How many of you are library connected? Okay, how many of you are, I'll say, health professional background, okay? And any of you may be connected to the autism community through patients or family members. So we have a bit of a mixture. Any medical or nursing students? So we didn't get those, okay. All right. Well, I kind of came to the history of autism. I think the history of autism, I'm going to try to convince you, is a very interesting story, and a story that is not easy to compress down to this much time. Even though I didn't ask how many of you are historians. I don't think we have any, probably. Oh, maybe? Okay, cool. Well, I would ask you one question about the history of autism to see if, what can anyone say about the history of autism? I bet there's at least one or two things that everybody knows. Is there more or less of it? More, right? It's diagnosed much more. So that's one thing everybody knows, right? And that's our starting point. Autism rates are increasing dramatically. And there's a lot of debate about that. And we're not totally sure if it's a real rise or change in definition, but that is a starting point. The other starting point I want to make is about the history of science. And the history of science, I think if most people think of the history of science as kind of a boring field, just sort of like you think of that first slide in a presentation, a list of accomplishments, of discoveries, all in a line, which implies the idea that science is about progress, that scientific knowledge expands, moves along one direction. And I'm going to argue that that is also an oversimplification, that both of these statements are oversimplifications. I'm going to argue today that autism is not simply a diagnosis that used to be really restricted and has been expanded, but it's rather a diagnosis that is actually transformed. It's morphed, metamorphosed over time. And I'm going to try to persuade you that that's important to understanding autism today. And I'm also going to try to argue that how we understand autism does not proceed along a little line where we get smarter and smarter and smarter about it. But again, it's a very zigzag line with a lot of twists and turns, and our knowledge is shaped by social context. So in a little bit more, we're going to kind of reinterpret the history of autism, which is, you'll be happy to know, only about a 70-year-long history, as a diagnosis that's not been merely expanded, but has been transformed. And we're going to look at 5 different constructions of autism, sort of 5 different, if you think of it as like a larva turning into a butterfly, 5 different stages on that route, and they're not each are a different form. They're not simply an extension of the previous one, and argue that this transformation has been have been influenced by culture. So I'm going to spend the first phase of autism, the first kind of autism, I'm going to spend a little longer on because it's going to be the hardest to understand. It's so different. I'm going to call it Autism 1.0, childhood schizophrenia, which is the label that a child who today would be called autistic would have gotten back in the earlier part of the 20th century. So think about, we have all these children diagnosed today, and now more adults diagnosed today with autism. And where were they all in the early 1900s, or much less the 19th century? The quick answer is we really don't know. They're not surveys that allow us to find out. We would presume that a lot of people who might have mild forms of autism would have stayed home, would have just somehow fit into the community. But what about people with really severe challenges? And I have families in my practice. You just have a hard time imagining how were they cared for at home. Well, there were institutions for the insane, but also the, quote, feeble-minded, the word they use for people we would say of intellectual disability. And in North Carolina, of course, we had four such hospitals. They expanded a lot in the course of the 20th century. And it's really shocking how, say, a child with what we call intellectual disability could be admitted to one of these with almost no questions asked. There'd be no diagnostic workup. They could literally just be admitted, spend their life there, and without a clear diagnosis. So some people speculate that the severe end of the spectrum might well have ended up in places like this. Of course, the really high-functioning people, some might have been scientists, but the lower-end folks might have been institutions. So we don't know a lot, but the word autism first was used in 1911, and actually it was coined by the Swiss psychologist Eugen Bleuler, who is mainly known for first coining the word schizophrenia. And when Bleuler, who's a Swiss from Europe, when he defines schizophrenia, he uses the word autistic for the first time as an adjective to describe how a schizophrenic person withdraws from reality into this fantasy world, detached from reality. It was an adult diagnosis for him, but starting in the 1930s, doctors began diagnosing schizophrenia in teenagers and then in children. They started seeing it earlier on. Now, this is strange to us today. We don't very often at all make that diagnosis in children. I'm a pediatrician. One thing we do in pediatrics, we always think, one concept that's familiar to us is that diseases present differently in children than adults. And they believe that too. So they didn't assume schizophrenia in a child would look like an adult. First of all, you didn't have to have manifest hallucinations or delusions. That was optional. What they did expect you to have, doctors basically interpreted children with autism who have these kind of elaborate rituals, and they would interpret that as the child is playing out a fantasy in their head. It's their equivalent. The ritual is like a delusion. So this is not legitimate thinking today in psychiatry, but in this time period, it was legitimate for psychoanalysts to speculate what was going on in the head of somebody with a mental illness. They had another twist on this. Psychoanalysis, I've already mentioned, is the rising school of thought. And psychoanalysts' explanation for why a child would pull into this world of internal fantasy was that they were reacting against the mother. And particularly they had this idea that it's called a schizophrenogenic mother, that a mother who's cold and maybe domineering created a reaction in the child to defend themselves by pulling into this unreal world. So this concept begins as well. Now let me just describe a case of a child who had the diagnosis of childhood schizophrenia from the 1940s. This comes from a publication. And if you've worked with children with autism, it's interesting. So first of all, the mother is a librarian. That was considered a little intellectual for women back those days. Maybe a setup here. Father a draftsman. Baby was progressed normally in infancy. Age 2, they began repeating single words but didn't smile much. Age 3, described as having parrot-like mimicry of Christmas songs, aversion to other children, preferring to play alone, and prone to stormy outbursts. This sounds very much like a child with autism. By age 5, good IQ but no interest in other kids, could recite long passages of poetry. So the word is schizophrenia. The word, that's how, but it sounds like an autistic child. This child, watch what happens though. The child, in the case history, gets teased and threatened by other children and because of following their commands literally. It starts to get really sad. The behaviors, the repetitive behaviors get more and more strange and bizarre. Age 9 was put in foster care, followed by 3 hospitalizations, and finally admitted to a home for the emotionally disturbed. Was given electroconvulsive treatment, which was done for schizophrenia in that time period. Then that did not help. Began to have obsessive talk about genitalia, said her father was the devil, defecated in the room, started having delusions, scripted delusions, saying the same thing over and over, which would be interpreted probably as autistic behavior. But can you see how this really looks schizophrenic? Can you also see how this is not just a matter of whatever DNA this child was born with? What else has shaped this child's trajectory? How they've been treated by others, right? And it's a world that can be very cruel to people with differences. And we talk about that today, but wow, the 1940s are at a whole different level. So you can see how all this brings together a picture that looks different than you can see why schizophrenia could be the label. Well, anyway, in the 1950s, this diagnosis becomes fashionable. It's widely used. It's a strange thing that's been forgotten. The word autistic is used very freely. So DSM-1, you know what the DSMs are? For those of you in psychiatry, the great classification system. The DSM-1 did not have autism diagnosis. It had a diagnosis called schizophrenic reaction childhood type. And it says under that, psychotic reactions in children manifesting autism will be considered here. So again, illustrating that this is where these kids that today would be called autistic would appear back then. Now the most notorious part of this period. Dr. Bruno Bettelheim, and many parents and grandparents in the autism world have heard of this name because he is the most famous popularizer of this idea that the mother causes autism. Bettelheim was a concentration camp survivor who immigrated to this country. He said he was a psychiatrist. He actually wasn't. He was a philosopher. But he somehow gets a new start in America, like so many do, raises funds for and builds this fantastic school for disturbed children in Chicago called the Orthogenic School. Writes a lot of popular books. He's really a public intellectual. And he proposes that autism is a reaction to extreme emotional neglect of the infant by the mother. And that idea I've already mentioned was in the air before. He takes it a step further because he thinks back to his concentration camp experience. And he likens autism to the reaction of some of his other inmates who, feeling totally with a loss of control, pulled into themselves. So really strange, but you can also see kind of captivating idea. This is a time when people are really fascinated and interested in hearing Holocaust stories. He picks up on that. And he writes a book that becomes a bestseller, The Empty Fortress, Infantile Autism, the Birth of Self. He's actually using a different word at this point. Mainly devoted this book to 3 case histories of children he claimed were cured of their autism. And the cure consisted of taking the children away from their mothers and putting them in a special school. Later, psychiatrists called this a parentectomy as a criticism of it. But he claimed that he had cured 40 children, but he never produced data on this. And he never even made clear that all these children had autism. And really, this title kind of appears in a later edition. It was called schizophrenia. They all use the word schizophrenia. And I think we should think of his patients being a grab bag of some who really had autism, some maybe with autism plus some kind of bad treatment, like the case I showed you. He may have had other cases of children who really were just severely neglected and developed which they call quasi-autism, autistic signs from being neglected. I think he had a whole range of cases. So to us, this sounded like the most horrible thing, blaming mothers. Not only you take this terrible diagnosis, but you blame mothers as well. We'd like to say that he was condemned roundly at the time, but he was not. Look at these publications from the time. The New Republic says, Bettelheim, hero of our times. Article by Robert Coles, very prominent child advocate and humanistic writer. Another article in a Catholic magazine, The Holy Work of Bruno Bettelheim. And this sort of gets to the lesson of why this first phase, which in some ways you don't need to know at all to take care of a child with autism, why I think you should know it. It reminds us that sometimes science goes terribly wrong. Here's another article about him, the man who cares so much. The problem for historian is, how does such a bad idea get so much attention? Okay. Again, he's not a fringe person. He is really I've just shown you examples of why he's so admired. I think many people say the example is that just that psychiatrists just had so much cultural authority in this time period. It is the heyday of psychoanalysis, and you can say you can also see how it's played into misogynistic ideas and the like. It does, but I don't think that's the full explanation. I think we have to, when you read the articles about him, what they talk about is how he treated the children. They tend to say almost nothing about the mothers in these articles. They all talk about what he did with the children, which I haven't said anything about yet. So at his orthogenic school, the children would be allowed, the idea was they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do because their mothers had suppressed them before. And so the therapist, he would have one-to-one therapists with these kids. The children would be allowed to spit on them, wee on them, bite them, slap them, and they had to just always take it. These extraordinary therapists. And Bruno Bettelheim presents this kind of unconditional love as a cure. He also let them dance on a giant statue of a mother to act out their anger. This therapy seemed very humanistic for children when you look at the alternatives. I've already given you one example of how a child might have been treated, Electroshock. Another treatment that was provided, and these pictures come from Life magazine in 1966. These children were given behavioral therapy. They're literally being shocked to change their behavior. This article describes children who are being taught how to smile and look you in the eye. And when they do it, they're given an M&M or a piece of candy. And when they don't, they're given a shock, electroshock. So this is not that kind of electroshock therapy, but it's like what people don't feel good about doing this to dogs anymore, but that's essentially what they're doing, very Pavlovian focus. So can you sort of see now how Bettelheim's, if you didn't think about the parents, you focus on the children, it sort of seems like this seems history seems very humanistic compared to this. And then when I say, well, why not think about the parents? The 1960s is the decade when child abuse has been discovered. And there's a lot of prominence of people recognizing that it really happens, and we haven't talked about it before. So he fits into that. So it was really tragic. I'm going to skip that slide. A whole generation of mothers are basically stigmatized by this theory. You can get a video called Refrigerator Parents, Refrigerator Mothers, I think it's called, where you see testimonies of women who lived through this experience of being blamed by the medical establishment. It's absolutely horrendous. The great thing the legacy of this is this theory, obviously, I'm going to relate that it went away at some point, but it left a memory of a whole community that remembers being injured by medical professionals. And remember that theme. Okay, remember that. So I'm sorry I didn't have medical students here because they're the ones who really need to understand this, that medicine's done some bad things. Okay, now my Autism 2.0. This is where people often start the history of autism, and it's autism's discovery by a doctor who is remembered, Dr. Leo Kanner, who's generally thought of as the father or discoverer of autism, who first describes the syndrome. He was the most famous child psychiatrist in America, worked at Johns Hopkins, and wrote the first American textbook called Child Psychiatry. He's a good writer, interesting person in a lot of ways, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about his article in 1943, where it describes how in 1938 he met a child that he said was unlike any he had ever seen before. His name was Donald Triplett, Donald T in the article. Donald was brought from Forest, Mississippi, all the way to Hopkins by his lawyer father with 30 pages of single-space type notes. I emphasize that because the father's notes, I think, have a lot to do with how autism was defined. Donald, according to his notes, basically was normal the first year, progressed normally, normal motor milestones. Second year of life, he was late talking. Then he begins to talk, but it's all just repetitious talk. He doesn't ask around, he doesn't talk to request something. Instead, by the time it's unclear whether it's 2 or 2.5, he's able to recite all, I think he says how many questions? All of the questions and answers of the Presbyterian Catechism. I think there's about 30, even though he couldn't ask or answer a question. By age 3, he could name all the American presidents forward and backwards. And yet he could not ask or answer a question. He stayed at Hopkins for a period of days, and Kanner watched him and observed him. It seemed that Donald just wanted to spend all his time by himself playing with a ball and spinning things and just saying these kind of wild things over and over. So Kanner was fascinated by this. And by the way, Donald T. has been found. He's still living in Forest, Mississippi. Maybe in the questions we can talk about that. It's interesting. Kanner just publishes Donald's story as well as 10 other children in this. This is probably the most famous article in the history of autism, Autistic Disturbance of Affective Contact. An article that still, I would say, reads well today because it is, unlike these doctors who diagnose schizophrenia, their stuff is not fun to read. It's very thick, full of psychiatric jargon. These are stories, and anyone who's taking care of children with autism will recognize the behaviors described in the story. I use it in teaching. So he published it in this report and coins what he calls early infantile autism. 11 cases in this first article. He keeps on describing more and more cases. He's at 150 by 1955. The central, what he calls the pathonomic feature that describes all these children, as interesting as they are in different ways, is that they are all united by what he calls a profound inability to relate to others from the very earliest stages of infancy, from very early life. So he calls it early infantile autism. The schizophrenia label could encompass people who develop symptoms much later, but this had to start very early on. He also said it was coupled with what he called, and this is his wording, an anxiously obsessive desire for the maintenance of sameness, manifested by strange rituals and repetitive behavior. And these are sort of the two parts of his diagnosis, which if you are familiar with DSM-5's description of autism, these are pretty much parallels to the two categories today, which I think is interesting. So I do find that a fair number of autism researchers and clinicians have heard of Leo Kanner and know about this article because it is so famous. They often refer to Kanner's syndrome, though they often use that word, Kanner's autism, as the severe end of autism today. Because I've already told you we're going to be leading to a story where autism, the diagnosis is used much more loosely today to describe people who much more social interaction than did Donald T., who really did seem to be, he's what would be called aloof today, he seemed to be in his own world. So people often assume it was just the severe end of today's spectrum. That's wrong. When you really look at his articles, you'll see that his kids are actually different as well. One thing is he drew a very sharp line between autism and what in the day was called mental retardation. He believed that there was no overlap, that all these children had at least normal intelligence. That was evidenced by the ones who could talk, by the kind of special skills I described, like as in Donald T. But even the nonverbal ones, he thought that their behavior, their ability to solve puzzles, and just their affect, how they looked, he thought they all had normal intelligence. You couldn't test them, he said, because of their language, but that's what he believed. So that's an interesting distinction. The other distinction is they believed that the special kind of intelligence they had was derived from the parents. Say a word about that. Here's a quotation from the end of his first paper. It says, "The parents are nearly as striking as the patients." He said all were highly educated professionals. 9 of 11 fathers held advanced degrees, PhDs or MDs, or even JDs. All the mothers were college educated, which is not typical for the time. Many of the extended families had representatives in organizations in lists like American Men of Science, Who's Who of Science, etc. And Connor was fascinated by this. And he continued to emphasize autism as kind of a PhD family kind of syndrome. Throughout his whole life, he believed in this. This is an interesting thing, because we don't think of this as part of the package of autism today. And it raises the question, why? Connor's clearly a good clinician. How did he come to this conclusion? Many would say, it's been argued that what happened was referral bias. Imagine that you're trying, Connor's the best known child psychiatrist in America. I use the example of Donald T. His parents were lawyers from Mississippi. Somehow got him all the way to Johns Hopkins. A child who's poor, less educated, is not going to do that. So referral bias, did that account for it? Well, actually, no. It works for Donald T., but if you look at most of those 150 patients, most of them are local. And the Phipps clinic at Hopkins that kind of works for, it's mainly drawing on local people. So that's not really the reason. So actually, I've done a study that's where a medical student working with me, I sent my medical student to the Phipps clinic at Hopkins, and we looked at the original records of these patients that Connor saw, and we looked at them. And we saw that all of the kids in his series were admitted under the label schizophrenia. That was their initial diagnosis, which sort of makes sense to you now, right? But they didn't all end up with that diagnosis. Only some ended up with autism. And here's what I think happened. As might be expected, he pulled out his case series out of a broader pool of kids with what he called childhood schizophrenia. He does seem to have been very struck at an early point by Donald T. and his family. That case seems to have been really important, maybe because the father's amazing notes. And he went on to find similar patterns, it seems, in other families. It's like he had this idea that seemed to stick in his head, and he found others that confirmed it. But then as he kept seeing more and more kids, he saw some that did not confirm it anymore. And what do you think he did with these other ones, where maybe families they weren't especially highly educated, or the child did not have a high IQ? He just called those childhood schizophrenia still. So this is what's called confirmation bias. You get an idea in your head, and it's a beautiful idea you can't let go. So that's what I think was going on. It turned out to be a pretty important example of confirmation bias, though, in history, because this idea will stick through at least the next 20 years. It's one reason autism will be diagnosed pretty rarely, because you've got to have this whole profile to make it. So Connor's legacy, the legacy of Autism 2.0, in contrast to his peers, he emphasizes clinical descriptions of behavior as opposed to speculation regarding the inner life, like had been done before. But remember, even though that looks objective, right? You're just describing cases, but there's still a subjectivity as your head shapes the cases in your head into a syndrome. Subjectivity comes in, and that's where he fell prey. His two core areas of autism, though, we should say still parallel the two in DSM-5 today. I want to mention that. We're still debating what to make of his observations about special intelligence, given that, he went too far with that. But as we'll come back, there is still a lot of interest, more so in recent years, about whether people with autism have special kinds of intelligence. He may have had a right idea, just gone too far with it. Now, Autism 3.0, and this is the main kind of autism you learn if you go to medical school or psychology school or whatever, neurodevelopmental autism. We don't talk about refrigerator mothers anymore. I hope not. So this pathway, which is the main way we conceptualize autism, is basically autism is rooted in the brain. It's not caused by the mother. And it starts in Britain, which I haven't said a word about so far. The British, it's sort of a little different story there. I've mentioned institutions being so powerful in America. The British shut down their institutions for the intellectually disabled earlier than we did. And that meant they started shutting them down in the late 50s and early 60s, which meant even in the 60s they were wrestling with how to label these kids who had been there. And that leaves a lot of good diagnostic work as they're trying to figure out what to do with them in the community. That's the background. So they sort of reshape autism. They have a working committee that develops a list of 9 criteria for autism. It looks a lot like Connor's, but they use the word islets of ability rather than saying that they are all precocious or all highly intelligent. which I actually think is, and maybe this shows I guess I'm kind of mainstream, but it kind of makes sense to me. That there's often a fragmented intelligence, being ahead in some areas but not in others. They have no role for psychodynamic speculation. Instead, they sort of frame autism as a disorder of sensory processing or cognition, a problem gone wrong with brain's development. And the great task of these British autism researchers is to figure out, so what's really going different with the brain, right? And they don't find one answer. In fact, we still have not found that answer. I'm going to call autism now 3.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 as different theories that were manifested. Some said that the issue was sensory processing, just like volume control, they can't take sensation is. That's surely true for many people who have autism. Others said that it was just a different way of processing language. Others said a failure of symbolic play. Another one of the last core ideas was mind blindedness, basically an inability to empathize or to get in somebody else's head. There are problems with every one of these theories, and there's more as well. And actually, I think in recent years, people have kind of thrown in the towel as far as saying, can we find just one master explanation that ties together all the different things in autism? But that's been a big theory of Autism 3.0, trying to find that. This is the single most important figure for Autism 3, Michael Rudder. And he is to Britain what Connor is to the United States. Child psychiatrist in London, and he has a little different way of putting together autism. So there are 3 core domains: social reciprocity deficits, language abnormalities, and rigid repetitive behaviors. Emphasizes the language much more. And he, kind of a trigger happy thing here, he's also very important. As I said, biology is being emphasized, and he finds evidence for biology being important through twin studies. And he did a lot of the first twin studies that showed that if you have one child, one of a set of twins has autism, the other one has a 60 to 90% chance of having autism. That's much higher than the sibling chance. So that implies genetics is really important. So that's a second of Rudder's many contributions. Here's another British researcher. I'm not going to give, there's tons of these researchers. I'm just highlighting those who I think are especially important. Lorna Wing, who basically did a huge study of children with autism in southern London. And she found that there really was a range of autism. That yes, there was a small group of kids who looked like Connor's kids, kind of completely, she called aloof. But there's another group called passive. They could respond to others, but they didn't know how to initiate responses. And then a third group, well, she used this rather unfortunate language, but she's British, active but odd. And I think by that what she meant was, this is from the publication, these are not my words, that these children wanted to engage with others, but they didn't really know how. That's her idea. Well, this idea of an autism spectrum is going to come out of this, and it's very important. So when we, Rudder really pushes on the idea that autism is biologic. Wing on autism is a spectrum. And it is Loretta Wing who actually rediscovers Hans Asperger's paper. Most of you, I saw a few heads wake up right then, because Asperger's pretty famous. Asperger wrote his cases of high-functioning autism same time as Connor. He was in Vienna, Austria. And there are some very interesting stories about him. Maybe we'll come back to in the questions. But he was one of many people who used that word autistic at the time, because write about schizophrenia. But his paper was rediscovered by Wing because he seemed to focus on what we call high-functioning people so much. And he wrote case histories. So Wing thought that he had really illustrated her idea that there's a kind of mild autism in people who are completely verbal, but just their language is maybe one-sided or lacks nuance, and they're awkward in relating to other people. So Asperger comes earlier, but he's brought into the story at this point by Loretta Wing, and you can see why. Now, because we're in North Carolina, we're going to mention the thinker who brings all these ideas in the United States. Is Eric Schopler. Have any of you ever heard of his name? So UNC, he's like a hero. He's a psychologist who really is in the 60s, as Connor's getting older. Remember, Connor did work 40s and 50s. The 60s and 70s, the baton goes on to Schopler, who's one of our homeboys. He's at UNC. And so he basically hated the refrigerator mother theory. He hated Bruno Bettelheim. He had trained under him. He thought he was I can't use the words, but he hated him. And he at UNC develops a program where he basically takes a lot of Rutter's thinking, and he and Rutter were actually co-editors of the main journal of autism. And then he also develops teaching approaches, which are not about parentectomy. They're the opposite. They're actually trying to bring the parent in as a partner. And he said he actually learned to listen from the parents about what works with a child. So he's like a good guy in this whole story. We've had some bad guys. And a key idea here is that he promotes early detection and treatment. Schopler does not have any illusion that autism can be cured. He does believe that if you can provide the right environment early on, you can make a big difference in these kids. And that is an approach that became known as North Carolina Teach. North Carolina was the first autism program, first in the country really to do that. Mainly because Schopler had a bunch of parents who basically took their kids down to the state legislature and unleashed them, is what they say. And the legislature said, okay, we'll give you the money. Key point here is this focus on early detection and treatment. Why have I pointed that 2 times? Because what Schopler believes is that we should be trying to diagnose it earlier and provide programs for it, okay? His is not the only program. The other program is what's called applied behavioral analysis, which is probably known as the leading approach nationwide to autism, which is really it's basically a behavioral approach to modifying autism, much kinder and gentler than what we saw before. It doesn't use shocks, okay, or M&Ms, but it's still an approach that looks at what motivates the child, and then how do we help nudge the child to communicate or do the right behavior to get what's their natural reward. And again, ABA is believed to work much better early on. So neurodevelopment of autism's legacies, this remains the main model for understanding autism. It gave rise to the American definitions of autism in DSM-3 and afterwards. Rutter's 3 domains, or basically DSM-3, and Wing's idea of the spectrum comes here as well. But what I emphasize here is there are all the ingredients now for the explosion of autism, because we have an elastic definition. Autism is being seen as a spectrum, and with every DSM revision, I have a whole talk on that. I won't do, but you can just see the definition being expanded, okay? And resources are being developed for early treatment. So there's a motivation to not call a child mentally retarded, which is the word they used at that time, but to call them autistic to get treatment. And that helps prompt public advocacy groups, parents. And these parents are like the most amazing parents as far as getting, drumming for resources. And movies and popular media come in. So all the ingredients come in for this, the explosion of autism in the 1990s. And this is kind of an old-looking slide. That's because it is. This is probably the first graph published that shows the rise of this, showing cases in the California school system as of the 1990s. Actually, the first time this graph was done was in the late 90s, but it looked just like that. I can't find the original anymore. So the thing to emphasize is that this rise in cases did not surprise Dr. Schopler or Rutter at all. Why? They have this elastic definition. They're all setting up early intervention programs trying to find these kids. They're expecting to find more, and they are. So they don't see a problem here. But it is a problem for another group of people. And now we come to autism for alternative autisms. And here we go back in time a little bit to a guy named Bernie Rimland, PhD, a Navy psychologist in San Diego. This is the height of the refrigerator mother theory time. And he has a son who has he can't figure him out, and eventually finds Connor's work, and he diagnoses himself with autism. He discovers the refrigerator mother theory. He thinks it's nuts. But he does agree that the parents of autistic children are distinctive. He also admits he's pretty obsessive. So he just goes on a crazy literature search and writes a book this thick on early infantile autism that basically slams the refrigerator mother theory. Yes?
What do you think about that father of the first little boy who wrote excessive and obsessive notes?
Yes. What do you think? What I think about the father? It does fit into that, and Connor very much noted that. So yes. So this is kind of. So the interesting thing, Bernie Rimland is a rebel against the refrigerator mother idea, but he totally believes that the parents are distinctive. And he just welcomed that. He thought, yeah, and that's okay. He thought that was good. So he becomes kind of a superhero for all of the parents who are out there who are ready now. It's the 60s, it's time to rebel, to have a rebellion against the refrigerator mother theory. And really, he becomes the center of a network of parents who come together, and they eventually form what today is the Autism Society of America. North Carolina is a chapter of that. It all starts with this. And when they had their first meeting, they all, apparently, I've been told the mothers all wore pins that showed a refrigerator turned upside down. Well, Rimland has a little different idea of what causes autism. So he has this great moment where he was a maverick, and he was right. He was right. And sometimes we have to remember, a maverick gets things right when all the polite PhD people who do studies don't. He believed very much in listening to parents, and that served him well early on. He keeps on listening, and it's going to lead him a different path that will separate him from other mainstream researchers. He hears stories of cures by special diets. And he's very, very interested in this. And he speculates there's a lot of different kinds of autism. So like the mainstream school, he accepts that autism is pretty much biologic. But it's not biological in terms of a disorder of brain development, kind of like cerebral palsy. It's biologic, more like a metabolic disease. Like PKU is a disease that if infants are born with it, they become intellectually disabled because they can't process one amino acid. If you give them a special diet, they're fine. He thought, when he heard these diet stories, that autism would turn out to be like PKU. And this is not a crazy idea, right? This makes good sense. He also heard stories about celiac disease and its behavior issues. He researches, his challenge is a little bit like Connor. He hears stories, but he doesn't really have a means to sort out what's really true and what's hearsay. He eventually fastens on what's called the leaky gut hypothesis, which was widely circulated in the 80s, that kids with autism have a gut that lets proteins through, especially proteins of milk and wheat, that are modified into compounds that look kind of like opioids and go into their brain and cause autism. And a researcher in Norway had found some products in kids' urine that seemed to substantiate this. That was not confirmed, but Rimland really goes for that. And he forms a research center promoting investigation of biomedical hypotheses, which are basically, it's sort of like a repository for parents to submit their own stories. You can see why parents loved him. He created a parent network called Defeat Autism Now, or DAN. None of the stuff about you just got to live with autism, like Eric Schopper would say, and learn how to structure your house differently and rearrange your house so your child can thrive. No, you can cure it. And so within this network that the notion of an autism epidemic takes hold. Because as he sees autism cases rising, he's thinking there's something in the environment. And of course, fetuses and infants are exposed to lots of things, but one thing they're exposed to, every parent knows about, because they see it going in their child's left thigh. And what is it? Shots. And so can you sort of see the trajectory that's happening here from Rimland's early speculation going to the leaky gut hypothesis, and now we have a gastroenterologist in England, Andrew Wakefield, who's researching the leaky gut hypothesis. But he goes on to believe there's a link to vaccines, and he is very infamous in medical circles for a paper in 1998 where he describes 8 children with autism, with colitis, and regressive autism after their measles vaccine. And this was just an earth-shaking paper. In some ways, gosh, I wonder if it's cited as much as Connor's paper. It's another case series. But it leads to vaccination rates plummet in England. He announces at a big press conference. MMR rates plummet in England. They go below the threshold you need to maintain immunity. Outbreaks of measles follow. And there's some 1,500 articles in published literature and popular media after this. It's really incredible. Some of you may have heard the story about what happened to him. It turns out it's an unhappy story of a maverick. I think he really did believe in his ideas, but he got carried along with them. There are all kinds of irregularities were found in his work, particularly his cases. When you hear these 8 cases of children who developed autism after a measles vaccine, you kind of wonder, were these random children or where did they come from? They all came from a lawyer who had referred them to him, and he did not disclose that. He should have. he did tests like spinal taps in the children with no consent. And most disturbingly, he was telling everybody we need to split the measles vaccine into its three components, the measles, mumps, rubella, but he didn't disclose that he had taken out a patent on a new vaccine that would be split. Not good. So that led him to be disbarred, and all his co-authors retracted the paper. His license was revoked, and do you know where he is today? Texas, where he still is today, and he still works in a consultation service. Biomedical autism, that's just your introduction to that. There's lots of versions of that. Soon after that, there was another version that thimerosal vaccines was the cause. That also got refuted. We can talk about that if you like. Heavy metals, like aluminum, have been talked about. Just getting multiple vaccines, sort of what Jenny McCarthy would focus on, just too many vaccines. Each of these has led to a whole wave of studies and refutations, but it just never seems to end. The leaky gut idea still is very much intact. It's a very common intervention. Lots of use of multivitamins. And, mainstream researchers will say, well, none of this is supported by evidence. But parents will say, well, there's lots of kinds of autism, and this worked for my kid. And there's kind of a standoff between many of these parents and the mainstream researchers. So lots of ideas here. So what are the legacies of this period? Well, this period is very much around. It continues to divide parents within the autism community, and that I want to underline that. And don't just think of it as only parents and then doctors are the mainstream group. There's a group of doctors in this set as well. The mainstream doctors would sometimes have very unhappy things to call them, but the parents in this group would call them dissident professionals. This whole thing became the focus of the biggest vaccine controversy we've had in the 1980s, and it really did turn out to be unfounded, so that was unhappy. Now we're leading to the last model, which has really emerged since the early 2000s, neurodiversity. And as the autism spectrum has been extended, you now have people who actually can express for themselves what they think about all this debate that's been about them. And there's a picture. So how many of you have heard of Temple Grandin? Thank you, yes. So I think if we had kept on the what do you know about autism history, that would have come up too. But a very powerful spokesperson for the autism community. And one of a lot of people who've been speaking out and really saying that autism, high-functioning autism, especially, is just a different way of being. It's not a pathology, and they like to highlight all these, the special gifts that many of them have. They've been writing many histories of their own, looking at different historical features and speculating who may have had autism. And among the scientific community, there's some very good candidates over time. They really are. So they really are onto something. The key things about this is it braces autism as identity, not a pathology. There's a focus on changing societal and cultural responses to autistic people. And they often express hostility towards efforts to cure autism. So to them, that's the wrong way to talk about it. But also they're ambivalent about preventing it too. So a lot of genetic researchers who are finding genetic markers of autism, they find themselves under attack by these people as well, who are very worried that there'll be prenatal test panels that'll be used to weed out people with autism. I don't think there's much real danger of that because it's like so fantastically complicated. But that's where they're coming from. So in conclusion, why is it important to kind of know this story? Why not just kind of get back to the usual one slide, here's how autism has evolved from Connor's concept to where we are today, and aren't we all a lot smarter? Which is how doctors usually relate history. Well, I would say each of these phases, each of these constructions of autism has left a legacy. So like different waves have left sand or left sediments on the beach. Childhood schizophrenia, what is its legacy? The main legacy is the legacy of parental distrust of medical professionals. So when you hear of the deep distrust of doctors that is common in this community, the stories of the refrigerator mother are known to a lot of these people. It is interesting if you ask, whereas not many doctors, for example, know about that. It is interesting that another legacy I'll say about this period is that the line between autism and schizophrenia, which was thought to be very firm, it may be breaking down now. Genetically, they look a lot alike, and they have to do with different environmental triggers that bring one out of the other. Connor's autism. Well, I would say, we talk so much about the terrible legacy of the refrigerator mother theory. I would say Conrad had a bad legacy too. The idea that the essence of autism is an inability to relate to your parent. That's a pretty terrible way to frame it. That to me sounds a lot like saying your child can't love you, right? That's a pretty hard thing to live with. And I never frame this way with families today. I never frame it that way. I frame it, your child does want to love you, may express that a different way, may need help expressing it, but they want to love you. But I think this generation of many parents influenced by Panner did not get that. That had to make raising the child much harder. He also created this image of autism as a disorder of white educated families, which led it to be missed in other populations. So African Americans sometimes, there's almost no stories of African Americans diagnosed with autism before the 70s. And there's actually, you can find some interviews on that video called Refrigerator Mothers. There's an African American mother who talks about her child with autism in the 60s and how went to the clinic and the doctor said he was emotionally disturbed. He didn't have autism. He said, we just didn't fit the label. We just didn't fit the package. So that's also, that's something that today there's still, the diagnosis is probably not, still more commonly a white diagnosis than an African American or Hispanic diagnosis, and that's a legacy of this period. I think his highlighting intellectual special abilities, though, I still think he was onto something. It's wrong to say it's a problem of PhDs or upper class people or highly educated people, but to say, I think there's still something to the idea that these kids can have special abilities. Give any of these kids an iPhone and watch what they do, even if they're nonverbal. You'll be amazed. I think if Conrad had that, anyway, that's interesting. This is the 3.0, the neurodevelopmental autism is our main framework today, and we still think of it as autism is heavily grounded in genetics. This has been very critical in promoting awareness of early diagnosis and therapy. It is worth saying that the Human Genome Project was 2000. The autism researchers expect to be much further along by this time understanding the genetics of autism. There was even, you'd see people like Michael Rudder was really hoping to find maybe 8 genes accounting for autism in different combinations. Well, today it's hundreds of genes, none of which are exclusively associated with autism. So the story of what's really going on is still unfolding, right? The 4.0 alternative autisms, the legacy here is getting the distrust of experts. I would highlight here that some of the animosity may be decreasing. And while the vaccine stuff, that's doctors are not amused by that. The idea that the gut has something to do with autism, I think more researchers are starting to realize there might be something to that. I'm sure all of you heard of this idea of the gut as the third brain. And there's very interesting research showing that like his autism have different kinds of flora. A lot of chicken and egg questions with this. But I think we should be careful not overreacting, just say because they're wrong about vaccines. I think we're very sure vaccines don't cause autism. But to say that every idea of this community is wrong because of that, I wouldn't go that far. And I'm personally wondering about the gut. And neurodiversity, a very important one, which I think reminds us to move away from the framework of curing a pathology to a more nuanced understanding of autism as an identity with special gifts. And when I talk with parents with a child with a new diagnosis, I always frame it this way. We can mention that they can expect some challenging comorbidities. A child who wants to sleep 2 hours a night, that's hard. But really want to emphasize the positive. And I think this reminds us all that how society defines who is disabled, is culturally dependent. Why is this that some people are labeled disabled and others are not? Well, that's a cultural consensus. All of this in the end leaves me with a sense of humility when I approach these patients. There's lots of people, lots of specialties, all think they've figured out autism. And as a general pediatrician, I just think we all have a piece of it and a lot to learn. And I think the parents are pretty important keys to understanding that. So that's probably the fastest review of autism you'll ever hear in 45 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
If you haven't already registered, please do so. We've got lots of food refreshments over there. I'd like to open this for questions and answers. and raise your hand, let me bring you the microphone. If you've ever been in a case when you've heard the answer but not the question, you know how sometimes that is totally confusing. So if you will raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone and you can ask your question.
Hi. It's my understanding that for the most part, autism is more highly diagnosed in boys than it is girls, and there's a lot more research coming out that's saying that they might be diagnosed in different ways. Do you have any thoughts, new information about that? Any comments on that?
Yes. So the question is, autism is diagnosed, it still is diagnosed more often in boys. And I think to me the question is how much that is some kind of cultural bias. Like, can we define it in a way that favors boys? Or is there really a predilection in boys? Okay. There's actually a researcher at UNC who's written a whole book on that whole issue of autism and gender, who does believe that the cultural construction issue is a very powerful part of it. I think she probably is right that it's been huge. When you just look at case descriptions of people with autism, they tend to use all this kind of male language in describing the rigid, repetitive behaviors. Having said that, I think the jury is still out. I think it's probably true that it's overdiagnosed I think it's probably true that it's underdiagnosed in females. But does that allow us to go so far as saying it truly is equal? I don't know that we know that. And there's some theories of autism that really even look at the gender difference and say that there may be still something to that. It's a great question. Maybe we'll know more in 10 years.
What age is a child normally diagnosed? And is it unusual for one not to be diagnosed until the age of 8 years old?
So when are children usually diagnosed, and is it unusual not to get diagnosis until you're 8 years or later? I think I've heard the average type of diagnosis is around 4 at this point. There's a big push to make it, there's a big push to screen children at 18 months and 24 months and bring the time much earlier, but it's still, I've often heard, around 4. I think, and I still think that has to do, so I don't know what happens around here if anybody's a clinician, but in many areas, if you get referred to early intervention, they don't do any specific autism testing until you're at least 3. I think that's part of what generates that late diagnosis. But 8 and older, I think that there are, I don't think the diagnosis definitely happens. There are diagnoses made in adolescence still. The older children, I think, often have just milder forms of autism, and I don't know that to pick them up early on, I think some of those you'd have to really be overcalling a lot of the young ones. I think really you only find some later. The ones who are diagnosed in adolescence, I think they're often a special picture, have many labels, don't fit cleanly into the classic autism or any picture, in my opinion. Some ways they're like the grab bag that used to be in childhood schizophrenia.
Another question. Do you see sometimes that a child that has been diagnosed previously with ADHD is eventually also diagnosed being autistic?
Yeah, if you have the previous diagnosis of ADHD, do you often then get a diagnosis of autism? That's actually a big focus of interest at Duke right now, that people are misrecognizing autism because the ADHD symptoms overwhelm them. I don't believe it. I'll have to say, I think that yes, it's true if you have the ADHD diagnosis, you're likely to get autism diagnosis later on, but I personally think that's more because you're catching an older population of kids who have just less clear labels, and they get just a set of different labels, often including ADHD. That's my own opinion. Because to me, ADHD in classic form looks pretty different than autism. Classic autism, you're looking at one thing and very focused on it. That's not classic ADHD. That's my off-the-record opinion. And I'm not speaking for the Duke Autism Center. Yes?
Mariana Walker, and I'm a speech language pathologist,
Okay.
also here on faculty, and one of my
Are you
areas.
pediatric, by the way, speech language?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Well, actually, I've worked in all from birth to death, but right now my focus is in
Okay.
pediatrics. And one of my questions has to do, again, with diagnosis, early diagnosis. And again, you know, we're trying to find out when are children screened in general for communication, and we're finding that sometimes that's not done until sometimes before they get to school, until they get to kindergarten. My concerns are if a child has a communication disorder and basically pragmatically related, do you think if that child is referred even later on that they might, or even early on, that they might be misdiagnosed with autism if it's more pragmatically based?
So wondering that if a child is referred early on for concerns about language, they might be misdiagnosed with autism when in fact they really just have what we call a social communication disorder. Is that your question? Oh yeah.
That's my concern, that, you know, that.
So that's an interesting concern. So I kind of applaud your concern. And I'm not sure if everybody in the room knows what pragmatic language disorder or social communication disorder means, but in the I kind of oversimplified the story, implying that it's just all a story of severe and milder autism. But no, there's really a group of kids who have only the issues with social communication. Issues reading somebody else, knowing how to ask and answer questions, how to converse. Maybe they're prone to one-sided conversation. And they may not have any of those rigid, repetitive behaviors. Okay? That in the DSM-5 it can be called, separated out and called a social communication disorder. And I believe it exists. And I think it's real. But I do think that just what happens when you're referred early on and you have clear deficits there, people will find something you're doing repetitively. And you'll get the autism diagnosis. Maybe because they feel like they'll get you services. But I just feel like that happens. And you can find it on anybody.
I think sometimes, you know, my concern too is that sometimes the teams who are making these diagnoses, sometimes the speech language pathologist is not involved to look at language from all the different domains that could identify this is more of a language impairment versus an autistic, an ASD.
Yeah, because it's usually doctors, psychologists, and a lot of these teams that make the diagnosis. It's not, a lot of times speech pathologists are not in the primary team.
That's what, yeah.
So
Concerning.
Michael Rudder would have loved you because he was all into speech and language being at the heart of autism, and he would have totally agreed with your point.
Thank you.
R-U-T-T-E-R. Get his picture, put it up on your wall. So you'd be happy in England where they went that path more. But I do, there is some evidence that we are, the pendulum has switched toward a pretty heavy early diagnosis of autism, early on. We're probably overdoing it a bit. Uh-oh. And go for it.
My question is more towards the younger adults that have been diagnosed or are having trouble with their own diagnosis. Some have been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder or personality disorder, and autism having those same traits, and how to differentiate that, I guess, is my question.
Are you talking about somebody who had an autism diagnosis and
No, they have
people now
a
don't believe
obsessive
it?
compulsive personality disorder diagnosis.
Okay, and people are wondering if it might be autism, high-functioning autism instead?
Because they have a family member or actually a very close sibling that has autism, and it's my understanding that not runs in the family, but has genetic properties with it.
Yeah. So that's another, I think you sort of brought up one boundary that is kind of tricky, okay? I think you're bringing up another kind of boundary. I've seen sort of the combination, remember obsessive compulsive disorder is considered an anxiety disorder. It's sort of a combination of anxiety and obsessiveness. And you can see parallels with that and Connor's domains, right? I think it gets tricky, and it can be misdiagnosed. I think what I hear is that the person with autism just loves doing things over and over. It just feels good. Whereas the person with anxiety/OC, it's more a response to relieve your anxiety. That's trying to give you a very quick answer, how people try to do it. But I think I do see the potential for confusion.
Thank you.
Good question.
My question is,
Sure.
as you were mentioning about the uncertainty about what really caused autism, the medication, how they're treating it, how are we coming to that this is the right medication for the symptoms? Are you treating just the symptoms or the something else? I don't know if that makes sense.
So your question is,
The treatment for
when we
autism.
use medications, is that to treat autism itself or to treat symptoms?
Correct.
Did I understand that as a question? So I would say it's clearly to treat symptoms when we use medications. And when I say medications, I'm talking about the kind of medications that psychiatrists use. So we have medications for ADHD. If you have autism and ADHD, you can use that. If you have anxiety and autism, that would be treated. Irritability or anger. But there's no, the mainstream Autism 3.0 perspective would not see there being any medication to treat autism itself at this point. They have long been hoping for one, although in the era of Autism 5.0, neurodiversity, they don't say that much anymore, right? Because you're not supposed to just treat autism itself. So that's interesting. Autism 4.0, alternative autisms, they're still all about trying to cure autism with vitamins and supplements. It all depends who you talk to. Good question.
I did a follow-up question to the question that she had. So do you find sometimes that when a child is being seen by a psychologist that has anxiety, some anger, that they could possibly be misdiagnosed as being autistic?
I think by a doctor, I see that a lot, by a pediatrician. And psychologists, I don't think I see that as much, but maybe I would, depending on who I'm working with. I don't know. I'd like to think they have a little more grounding in making the difference. I can certainly picture it happening.
What kind of test does a psychologist normally
Good
administer
To diagnose autism.
to diagnose?
So the test, and maybe one reason I don't think psychologists do as much is that it tends to be a pretty, at least for experienced psychologists with a good reputation, they might do 9 hours of evaluation or 7 hours. First with a long intake, a visit just with a parent, I'm talking about a child here, taking lots of questions. Then a second visit that's doing a test called the ADOS, which is a very complicated exam that basically sets up situations trying to provoke autistic behaviors. And then a third interpretive session. That's a pretty careful process if you really do all that. And I think, although I think your point still could happen that you might diagnose some kids who have social communication issues because that, when you do that ADOS test in a closed room where the child's kind of freaking out, they'll start to repeat themselves. I think they'll often get at the right answer. Compare that to when a child sees, say, a medical doctor who, some neurologists, I think, will just sort of see a child in their examining room. And I think my examining room is like an autism. If you weren't autistic, you're going to be that way by the time you get out of my room. Because there's so much noise and craziness. You just observe a child and make a call. They're the ones I think who especially could miscall it, in my opinion. All of us can make mistakes. I sure hope that theme comes through, that we all are getting, it's gone now, but we all just get a little piece of all this. We could all make mistakes. And even if I give you a couple, I think I've made a few statements here that were my own opinions, which I hope I stated clearly. And I also am that's my perspective as a general pediatrician. We all are limited. Well?
I've worked as an epilepsy educator, and some of the training I got was that epilepsy is a comorbidity with autism, that it's a higher incidence in children diagnosed with autism. What are your thoughts? Is that a sign that it's an underlying brain disease? Why is that? And I did once give a talk to parents of autistic kids at an annual meeting in the Nebraska Autism Society and met Temple Grandin's mother, and the talk was called, "Is it a behavior or is it a seizure?" Because the parents wanted to know how to tell the difference. Anyway, your thoughts on seizures in autism?
So it's got two questions there. Are seizures more likely in people with autism? Is that a clue to what's causing autism, I guess? And the answer is yes. The first one, yes, seizures, I think it's pretty clear, are more likely in children with autism, especially those who are more classic or lower functioning. I think there's no doubt about that. And that does seem like it would be a clue that, that's one that was cited by the proponents of Autism 3.0, neurodevelopmental autism, that autism is rooted in the brain when it's real, because it's kind of harder to see how a refrigerator mother would cause you to have a seizure. Right, so that's an argument that's biologic. It is, I think your last comment just refers to how children with autism have a lot of, they're called stereotypies, these unusual behaviors they like to do over and over. And they can seem to be, sometimes that might raise the question of a seizure. So all of my patients, I ask, do they have staring spells that you think might be a seizure? But then there's often some hard questioning afterwards. And sometimes we still try to do an EEG if we think we can do it, when we just aren't sure. But it's hard. I don't know what your question is. I tend to ask the parent, can you poke the child and does it stop? And if they're not sure, if they're not sure that it'll stop, I say, well, maybe we need to get this checked. It could be some kind of seizure.
I'm old enough to remember when the phrase refrigerator mother was fairly common. I would guess that would be been in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
And at that time, I'm not even certain, I don't think I had heard of the word autism. At least it wasn't very common at that time out in the lay literature.
Mm-hmm. So you heard refrigerator mother, but you didn't really hear of autism.
No, they might have been calling it something else, or it's possible that just the phrase refrigerator mother stuck with me. In fact, I would think, in retrospect, that's very possible. That produced such a awful feeling that I might have remembered it. And in fact, that could be some of what's happening with some of the other people who are responding today to medical professions in autism.
It's quite a horrendous term, isn't it? It was often blamed on Bruno Bettelheim, that character I showed you. It was actually Dr. Connor who came up, not with refrigerator mother, but in his first article he said it was as if the children were kept he did talk about their parents not being cold emotionally as well as being smart. And he did say it was as if the children were in a refrigerator that did not defrost. And Time magazine took that article and the heading was Frosted Children. That was in the 50s. And I have a feeling, I think you raised a really interesting question. Actually, I'm not sure I thought about it before. I bet that the word took on a life of its own. And kind of a male lash word, in the 50s, when women were going in the workplace in the 40s. In the 50s, they have to go back and it's supposed to be at home, like Leave It to Beaver. And in that time period, you could sort of see this word might be sort of catch on by people who want to label these mothers who are in the workplace. And it might go way beyond autism. That's an interesting question.
Anybody else? Well, in that case, thank you very much.
Okay.